Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the second in the Champinefu webinar series, Trees and Forests of Mary's Peak, The Stories They Tell. My name is Mike Hansen, and I'm a Public Services Librarian with the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library, co-sponsor for the series. Before we start, I have a couple of quick announcements. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation tonight. On your screen, you should have a box for submitting questions. It may be indicated with a question mark or something similar. You could submit questions throughout the webinar and we'll answer as many as we have time for at the end. When submitting a question, it would also be helpful if you can please indicate who the question is for. The next webinar in the Champinefu series about Oregon's 100-year water plan is on December 8th at 7 p.m. I'll post a registration link for that in the chat. It should be showing up in the chat now. You can also find a link on the library's events webpage. And now on to tonight's event. I would like to introduce Dave Eckert, Program Director for the Mary's Peak Group of the Sierra Club, who's responsible for coordinating the Champinefu webinar series, including tonight's event. Dave, would you like to join me? I think we may have a brief technical issue. I think Dave is trying to rejoin us right now. There you are. Hey, Dave.
Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, I apologize. All of a sudden, I lost all Zoom or GoToWebinar, whatever we are.
Right.
Okay, sorry for that. You want to put me on share screen, and I will
Yes.
put. Yeah, that moment of panic was.
All right, I think we're good now.
Okay. And okay, can you see my screen now?
Yep, we see it.
Okay. Okay. Welcome everybody to the Champinefu Lecture Series. And for those who've never been to this before, are you seeing the picture on my slide? I need to ask that first.
We're seeing your slide, yeah.
Okay, just that's all you see. Okay, good.
Yep.
Champinefu is the Kalapuya word for the area around Benton County, Oregon, that really centers or focuses around what is now called the Marys River. And the area goes from the Willamette River up the Marys River, a certain distance as shown by the lighter color in this map, and it then extends all the way up to the eastern top of Mary's Peak. And so that is Champinefu in the Kalapuya language. Now, if I'm, for some reason, I'm not getting my, this has not been a good day. I'm not getting my PowerPoint to go forward. Oh, there we got it. Okay, good. So this is the 5th annual Champinefu series. We started in 2016. I've had a lot of 3 presentations every year. We started live at the Majestic Theater, and then with the pandemic, we turned virtual. Our first one this time was Fire Since Time Immemorial, Indigenous Fire Chronology. And that has been recorded, and you can find it on YouTube. Just go to YouTube and type in on the search Fire Since Time Immemorial, and then you will get that. This one, of course, you've already had to introduce the trees of Mary's Peak and the stories they tell. And the next one is Oregon's Water, What Coyote Can Teach Us, on December 8th. And if you haven't registered for that, I really recommend it. Like all three of these will be something very special. Our sponsors are the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, which selects the topics and provides the speakers for the presentation. The Mary's Peak group of the Sierra Club, which initiated the conversations with the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde to initiate this whole process, set it up, and that's who I'm representing here tonight. The Spring Creek Project, located at OSU, has been a co-sponsor from the beginning, and they provide ancillary programs that go along with this, providing opportunities for artistic creations resulting from this. And I highly recommend you contact them, look them up, and participate in their projects. The Corvallis Sustainability Coalition is a new co-sponsor, particularly the Community Inclusion Action Team. And that came as a result of a legacy donation from Frances Stillwell, a noted landscape artist of native plants. Thank you, Frances. And as you already heard from the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library, which provides the hosting for this program. And we're very grateful for them doing all of this work and recording it and posting it and everything. So thank you. Tonight, let's get right to it. The trees of Mary's Peak and the stories they tell. Many people on this webinar or who hear the recording may not know too much about Mary's Peak. This program tonight is really about the trees of Mary's Peak. So if you want to learn more about Mary's Peak itself, you can go to a website it's called Vimeo, and it's up at the top of the screen. Just go to vimeo.com, and then on the search, look for Mary's Peak Field Trip, and that'll come up, and you can watch it for free. It's a 1-hour show with 22 segments about different aspects of Mary's Peak, and it's a very special place. Okay, our presenters tonight. The first presenter is Ed Jensen, and Ed is an OSU Professor Emeritus from the College of Forestry. And he's the author of many books that I have with me and have read and reread and reread again. Trees to Know in Oregon, Shrubs to Know in Oregon, and he's co-authored a manual of Oregon trees and shrubs, weedy plants in North America, and Planted Forests, Contributions to the Quest for Sustainable Societies. Ed received the President's Award for Oregon Community Trees and was the Elizabeth P. Ritchie Distinguished Professor at OSU. Now, personally, Ed has helped so many people here around the Western Oregon, and he's known as a rock star, actually, and but even though he deals with trees, and he's a rock star of trees, and not just the books, but the one-on-one help he gives. He has been an interpretive guide for us up on Mary's Peak, showing the trees. He's helped us start native arboretums in local schools. He's just a one-person tree machine, and we are very, very honored to have him with us tonight. The second speaker, and we'll have two speakers, the presenter, is Greg Archuleta. Greg Archuleta is a Santiam Kalapuya, Clackamas Chinook, Tumwater Chinook, and Shasta member and elder of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. He is also a cultural resources analyst on the staff of the Grand Ronde Cultural Resources Department. He is also a renowned artist and whose work has been acclaimed throughout the Pacific Northwest. I have personally gone to some of his showings. His works are remarkable, and the cultural content of those works are something to behold. And also personally, Greg is a wonderful teacher of Kalapuya and other Pacific Northwest tribal cultural activities. He can go into that if he likes. There's so many. I don't want to even reduce him to just a couple of types of courses that he's taught. He has been another interpretive guide for us on Mary's Peak. If anybody talks about Kalapuya culture, it will be Greg. And he as a final thing I want to mention about him is our daughter. My daughter is a teacher in Corvallis in the elementary and middle schools, and she has a program about cultural heroes, and he is one of the few living cultural heroes that she teaches about in her class, and she's very honored to do that. So, Greg, thank you. And so Ed will be the first speaker, and then Greg, and then we'll have Q&A following that. So let's move on and get right to Ed. Mike, if you can, I'll turn myself off and you can turn on Ed's machine and everything. So thank you.
Okay, that looks okay to me. Are we ready to go?
Looks good from here.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, thanks for the introduction, Dave. A little bit overblown, but I'll take what I can get at this stage of my career. Anyway, hi everybody. It's nice to be with you this evening. I would much more enjoy meeting with you in person, but we're going to have to do this through the marvels of modern technology, and hopefully I can get across some of the things that I would share with you if I were there in person. So I chose this particular photo as my title slide because it so clearly delineates the area that we're going to talk about tonight. So everything in snow here, from the base of the mountain to the top of the mountain, is included in this presentation on trees and forests of Mary's Peak. And far and away the dominant forest type, all the way from the base of the mountain almost to the top, is Douglas fir forests. And there's typically western hemlock mixed in, often much younger than the Douglas firs. And as you move towards the top, there's more and more western hemlock because it likes cool, moist environments. And then at the very top, where you see the steep snow, those, of course, are meadows, and that's why they stand out. But surrounding the meadows are beautiful, majestic stands of noble fir. And so we'll talk more about that as we go, noble fir being kind of the signature tree of Mary's Peak. We can also see in this that there's a pretty clear delineation here between young stands dominated by Douglas firs below this line, and the older stands of Douglas fir above that. And I'm told fairly recently that a lot of these younger forests originated following the Columbus Day storm in 1962, which in the period of about 24 hours blew down 11 billion board feet of timber stretching from northern California to southern British Columbia. And it's hard to put 11 billion board feet of timber down in one day in perspective, except that was far greater than the annual harvest that occurred in Region 6, which is Oregon and Washington of the U.S. Forest Service. So there are many places in the Coast Range that still show evidence from that 1962 storm. So our purpose today, as Dave suggested, is to help you learn to identify the major tree species that occur on Mary's Peak, and I'm the one doing that. And secondly, to help you learn about some of the culturally significant uses of trees and shrubs of Mary's Peak, and Greg will do that. And we're both scheduled for about a half an hour, and that if we're able to complete that, we'll have a half an hour for questions at the end. So just for general information, I've listed on this slide common conifers of Mary's Peak and common broadleaf trees and a few shrubs of Mary's Peak. And if we look at the conifers, these are all of the native conifers right here. And then there's one small grove of Port Orford cedar that I'll describe to you when we get to that. And really it's Douglas fir, western hemlock, and noble fir that are the three principal tree species that define the forests that cover Mary's Peak. And even though when you look from a distance at the forest, all you see are conifers, it's important to realize that there are lots, sorry, I have a jumpy mouse sometimes, and then I have to remember which way to go. It's important to realize that there are lots of large and small broadleaf trees that are embedded in those forests and grow underneath the much taller conifers. So they're not always obvious to the eye, except sometimes in the fall, but they're there. Also, in the Pacific Northwest, we have a large number of shrubs that get to be very large, and they can be 30 or sometimes 40 feet tall. And a few of them have tree-like forms, but most of them have multiple stems that more clearly identify them as shrubs. So I'm not going to show much about these shrubs, but Greg may refer to them because many of them had important cultural uses. So we'll start first with the conifers, and the list here is not so important. It repeats what you just saw, but to the right there's a photograph of the beautiful, majestic noble fir stands that occur on the top of Mary's Peak. So many of you will know this tree species already. This is Douglas fir. And Douglas fir is certainly the dominant tree at Mary's Peak, growing in extensive, far-reaching stands, both young stands and old stands, as we see depicted on the two photos on the left. It dominates all of the forests of Mary's Peak except for the noble fir stands at the very top. Ecologically, Douglas fir is a really interesting species in that it's an early successional species. It germinates and grows on bare mineral soils that stay moist. So it's one of the first trees that occupy sites that are disturbed by fire, by logging, by various settlement activities. But it's a very old, it's capable of reaching very old ages for an early successional species. The Douglas fir can dominate a site for 5 or 6 or 700 years. And as it ages, more shade tolerant tree species, especially western hemlock, will seed in underneath the tree because the hemlock kind of needs to grow in the shade of the taller trees. And as the Douglas fir reaches 500, 600, 700 years old, the trees, the individual trees will start to die and fall apart, and the western hemlock will be there to take over. At least that's the theory. There's not a lot of examples where that actually occurs in the Northwest, because almost always before 500, 600, 700 years, there is some major disturbance like fire or catastrophic wind throw that starts the successional process over again. But that's the niche that Douglas fir occupies. So there's a lot of good identifying characteristics for Douglas fir, and most of you probably already would recognize this as a Douglas fir cone. In terms of characteristics, they're typically 3 to 5 inches long. They're cylindrical. When they're mature, they hang down from the branch. You can see the branch along here, and it hangs down. The cones are composed of thin-edged woody scales, and the woody scales are separated by papery bracts. And if you're an adult, we would often describe these as trident-shaped or pitchfork. For younger members of the audience, we often start off describing it as a mouse running into the cone, and these are the back feet and the long tail of the mouse. So Douglas fir cones typically mature in a single year, although the process from the starting and the stopping of the cone development is actually much longer than that, something in the order of 14 to 17 months. But what you can see visually, this cone developed in a single year, and this is probably last year's cone. We can see that the scales are a bit open and the seeds have probably already fallen out, and before too long the cone will abscise or fall off of the branch to which it's attached. This is this cone earlier in the growing season. So this is a developing cone for this year. So this, by the end of the growing season, will look like this. And interestingly, this is the female flower that's developing the seeds inside it. Flower is not quite the correct term, but I'm going to use it because people understand what flowers are as opposed to strobiles or strobili. And this is what the flower starts out like. It actually grows upright because it needs to capture pollen that's floating on the wind, and the pollen floats in and gets stuck on the bracts, and a pollen tube develops and fertilizes the eggs down here to begin to form seeds. And when that happens, this goes from an erect or upright flower to a hanging down flower like this. These, on the other hand, are the pollen cones. So technically, these would produce pollen, which would fertilize these. And the male and female flowers are in separate structures, but they occur on the same tree. But the males and the females on the same tree develop at different times, so that the pollen from one tree doesn't fertilize the female from the same tree. Of course, all the children would be idiots and they'd never survive if they were self-fertilizing. So if we look at the needles, that's a joke, but I can't hear you snickering in the background. So that's one disadvantage of the virtual lecture. So the needles are not particularly distinctive until you get to know them. They look a lot like true fir needles, although they're a little narrower. They're typically about an inch long. They're green on top. But what is distinctive about this twig covered in needles are the buds, and the buds are relatively large. They're sharp pointed at the end, and they're reddish brown, and that uniquely identifies it as a Douglas fir branch. And then if we look at a close-up of the twig, we'll see that each needle is attached to a little barely raised peg. Sometimes they're flat, sometimes they're rougher than others, but they're less rough than spruces or hemlocks, and they're more rough than true firs. So that raised leaf scar can help you distinguish a Douglas fir twig from a true fir twig. Bark is also a good characteristic, but we see here 3 different samples of bark and how different it is over the age of the tree. So this is a young Douglas fir stem. It could be attached into the ground and maybe the tree is 10 or 15 years old, or it could occur up here at the top of the tree where the trunk is also very young. And we see it is kind of gray-green in color, and it has these resin blisters, as do true firs. So this would be very hard to tell apart from true fir bark. And the purpose of the resin blisters is that they contain a real sticky substance inside called resin that's intended to inhibit boring insects from boring into the trunk, because insects will get stuck in there and they can either be actually expelled away from the tree, or they'll be all sticky and they may actually die in the tree. Then as the tree matures, the bark turns very thick and ropey, and this might occur at 75 to 100 years. It has deep ridges and furrows and is very distinctive in that regard. And if we took a cross section, if we cut the end of this bark off, it would look like this. It would look like we took a pound of bacon and we cut crosswise on the bacon, and we have these alternating colors of red and cream. And so that's almost unique to Douglas fir. White fir does it a little bit also. And then as the tree gets really old, and maybe it's 400 to 600 or 700 years old, it loses that ropey bark and becomes scaly, and it flakes off the tree. And often you'll find mounds of bark that are 2 or 3 or 4 feet deep around the trunk of the tree. So lots of good characteristics for identifying Douglas fir. So I'm often asked that people will see big Douglas firs growing on Mary's Peak, and they'll wonder if they're old growth. And as far as I know, the answer is no. At least technically they're not old growth, but there are stands containing large old Douglas firs. So why is that not old growth? Well, by definition, old growth Douglas fir forests must have the following characteristics. They must have large old Douglas firs in the overstory. They have to have more shade tolerant species in the understory. In this case, western hemlock would be the likely one. They must have large standing dead snags or standing dead trees that are beginning to fall apart. And they have to have large decaying logs on the floor. So in this particular photograph, we see a large old Douglas fir. I can't really estimate the age, but it's probably over 100 and less than 200. Growing underneath it are western hemlocks of different sizes, some fairly good sized ones here and here, and some small ones in the understory. And there's large woody debris on the forest floor, and all of those things need to be present for Douglas fir. And because of the history of the mountain, a lot of times this component is here, the large old Douglas fir trees, but the other components may not be there. So there are a few large old, few forest stands dominated by large old Douglas firs, but technically they're probably not old growth. Okay, so in contrast to Douglas fir, western hemlock is a late successional species. It typically invades sites that already have an established forest, like an established Douglas fir forest, and the seeds of the hemlock will seed in underneath and use the cover of Douglas fir to keep a shady, moist environment, which western hemlock looks like. If a site with western hemlock in it remains undisturbed for many hundreds of years, the western hemlock may eventually take over, but as I said before, that often doesn't happen. Succession gets reset before that. So a lot of people can identify western hemlock by the growth form, whether it's a large tree like this and they see the floppy leaders at the top. That's the topmost branch that flops over. And they also see that the lateral branches flop over. That's because the twigs are very thin and they not totally able to support the needles that grow on it. And this is actually a seedling in the forest, and even when the tree is very young, it has that very floppy nature. Here's the cone of western hemlock, and it looks a bit like the Douglas fir cone, except that it's much smaller. They're only about 3/4 to an inch long. They have thin scales like Douglas fir, and they do have bracts, but the bracts are shorter than the scales, so you don't actually see them. They too develop in 1 year, so this is probably last year's cone. Again, the scales are open, the seeds have fallen out, and this is this year's cone, which will develop into this. And I couldn't really get a female hemlock flower, but this represents this at an earlier stage of development. And these little corncobby things are the pollen grains. Again, the male and female flowers occur separately, but on the same tree. Bark is not particularly distinctive until you've seen a lot of it. It often looks a bit like Douglas fir, but tends to stay much thinner than Douglas fir, and it does not have that bacon looking color to it, the red and cream colored layers. It has red and purple colored layers, and only a few layers at that. The needles for Western hemlock are pretty distinctive. They are short, almost always shorter than 3/4 of an inch, and there's typically two different lengths on the same twig. So there's a long one and a short one, and a long one and a short one, and often the short ones get shunted up to the top of the twig like along here. They're green on top. They have two bands of stomatal bloom on the bottom, which Douglas fir, that would also describe Douglas fir, but Douglas fir needles are longer. And the twigs of Western hemlock also provide a good identifying characteristic. The twigs are quite rough and they have diagonally raised pegs. And where'd my mouse go? There would be one needle coming from this peg and one needle coming from this peg and one needle coming from this peg. Okay, so just to comment on the common name, hetero means different, phyla means leaf. So there's something about the leaves that are different, and I'm not sure whether it's because there are two different length needles or whether the needles are different color on top and bottom, but that's what the heterophyla means. And tsuga is actually a Japanese word that refers to mother tree. So there are hemlocks that occur in Eastern Asia as well. Oops, sorry. Okay, now the signature tree of Mary's Peak is noble fir. And noble fir ecologically is similar to Douglas fir, but at a higher elevation. So noble fir is an early successional species, but it lasts, stands can last for a long time, often 300 to maybe 400 years. The foliage is not very tolerant of growing in the shade of other plants or of itself, and so you often get these beautiful pruned up boles, making this a very majestic looking tree. There's the overall range, the total range for noble fir is the Pacific Northwest. It grows from Mary's Peak north to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. And Mary's Peak is the southernmost extent of noble fir growing in the Coast Range, which makes it important and unique. In the Cascades, noble fir grows from about the California-Oregon border to the Washington, British Columbia border to the north. So there's several good characteristics for identifying noble fir. Probably the most commonly used are the cones, which are large and barrel-shaped and grow upright and stay upright through maturity. And you see all these little whiskers sticking out here. Noble fir, like Douglas fir, has bracts that stick out, although they're not as three-pointed as Douglas fir cones. And all true fir cones are born upright, and when the seeds mature, the scales fall off. And when the scales fall off, the seeds fall out. And so in the fall and through the winter, you'll see this large cone stalk remaining on the tree. There's a few scales up here, a few scales up here. And on the forest floor, you'll find things that look like this. You don't typically find full cones unless squirrels have just cut them down. So in this case, this is a thin scale, but it's actually curled back on itself, so it looks thick. And this is the bract that sticks out, and then the seeds are born in here. And typically there are 2 seeds per scale. So needles are also a good characteristic. Noble fir is noted for being very blue-green in color on both the top of the needles and the bottom of the needles, and they're very bushy, almost like bottle brushes. And if we look at the underside of the twig, we'll see that the needles also have 2 lines of stomatal bloom on the bottom, like hemlock and like Douglas fir, but they're uniformly bluish green on top. And if we pluck off those individual needles, we'll see the little suction cup-like leaf scars, generally round and flat. So there are no raised leaf scars, no woody pegs like there are in Douglas fir or hemlock. And you can identify the very large noble fir has probably the largest cone of all the true firs, so you can see them even from quite a distance. They're very majestic. The bark, the young bark is typical for Douglas fir and all true fir barks that have resin blisters in them. But as the bark gets older, it differentiates into kind of thin, platy bark, so that's not particularly unique. And next we'll look at grand fir, and I've only seen scattered individuals of grand fir on Mary's Peak. If you get in the Cascades or other parts of the Coast Range, it gets to be a fairly common tree and often grows in association with noble fir that we just looked at. So many of us would identify grand fir in this form because it's one of our most common Christmas trees. And one of the interesting things about it has a chemical in the leaves that have a very orange smell. And if you get a fresh cut grand fir Christmas tree and put it in your house and leave the house for a day, you come back and you go, what's that orange smell? That's the smell of grand fir, so it's very nice. So, but it gets to be much larger than Christmas trees, and they grow to be 150 feet tall probably. Needles are a good characteristic. They're green on top, and they have 2 lines of bloom on the bottom, but that's not so unique as the needles tend to be, if you look down the barrel of the twig, this is the end of the twig looking back towards the next older twig, they tend to be flat across here, and that's referred to as 2-ranked, like 2 rows of soldiers. So that's a good grand fir characteristic with long needles that are 1 inch or more long. And they typically also have 2 different links involved. At least it looks like that by the way they're arrayed on the twig. Bark, this looks just like the bark that we just looked at, and this doesn't look very different. So bark is not a particularly great characteristic, except that at this stage, it will identify it as typically a true fir. Cones are similar, but much smaller to the noble fir cones that we just saw. They're kind of finger length and they're more cylindrical, but they, at maturity, they stick up throughout their development. At maturity, the cone scales fall off and leave those same spikes. These are the female flowers that give rise to these. These are the pollen flowers, or they're typically called pollen cones. So this is called a cone and this is called a cone. And they can be red or they can be greenish yellow in color. And as the pollen develops, it'll get very yellow around here. And like all true firs, there are round or elliptical flat leaf scars. And here we see a cross section of the bark. Here's the wood in here and the bark out here. And we see that it has layers of red, dark red and purple, very different from the Douglas fir bark that we looked at before. Okay, a tree that's extremely important to Native Americans and early Euro-American settlers is the Pacific yew. Taxus is the name of the genus. It's based on a chemical, Taxol, that's contained in the leaves and the bark and the roots of the tree. And it's called brevifolia, breva short, folia leaf. So the person who named this was probably used to seeing English yew and said, oh, this is a yew, but it has shorter leaves than English yew. So this is a tree that grows as scattered individuals. Once in a while, you'll find what you might call a grove of them, but usually they're scattered individuals. It's a small understory tree. This tree was probably only 20 or 30 feet tall, and by the looks of the diameter, it could be 500 to 1,000 years old. So they're very, very slow growing and have very dense wood that's used for quite a variety of things. Typically, it does not have a distinct growth form because it has to struggle to find the light. So it doesn't actually struggle to find light, but if light is available, the branches grow. And if it's not available, they grow much more slowly. So these needles look a lot like Western hemlock needles. They are green above and they're arrayed in a flat two-ranked nature, but they're all the same length, at least for 1 year. This year could be the same length, and this year all the needles would be the same length, but could be shorter or longer. And on the underside of the needles, there's no white bloom like there is on Pacific yew. So this is the very strange cone here and here of the yews in general. And this is actually just one bract that instead of turning woody swells up and turns red or orange. And here's one seed inside. So people often ask, well, if this has a fleshy fruit, why is it considered a conifer? Well, it's probably considered a conifer because it has evergreen needles, but this is the conifers are defined as having naked seeds. They fall out of the cone before they germinate, as opposed to an apple, which falls on the ground, and the pulp of the apple has to dissolve before the seeds are exposed. Well, this is the seed, and it always stays naked. It never gets covered up by this swollen red bract. Now, this seed is very toxic to mammals. And so y'all should not go eating these in the forest, even though they look like a delectable berry. If you swallow a seed, it'll make you very sick, or it might even kill you. They're very potent. Oops, sorry, not quite done yet. Not quite done yet, I said. The flesh is actually edible, but you'd have to be really careful to separate the seed completely from the flesh. Birds, on the other hand, can eat these with impunity. They digest the fleshy part off of here and then poop out the seed without digesting it at all. Bark of Pacific yew is pretty interesting. It's very thin, regardless of the age of the tree. It's very scaly and flaky. It may be purplish red in color, or it may be brown. That's probably a function of genetics and probably a function of whether the tree developed in the full sun or the full shade. And some of you remember that probably around 1980, there was a big push in the Pacific Northwest to collect Pacific yew bark because this Taxol chemical that it contains is an aggressive killer of tumors in humans. The toxic chemical that's in the seed that might kill you if used in the right dose can be distilled. It can be distilled from the bark, and if used in the right dose will actually attack and kill tumors, especially ovarian tumors and breast cancer tumors. Okay, next, occurring generally as a later successional species and generally occurring, I've seen it mostly in Mary's Peak as scattered individuals, is Western red cedar. It likes to grow on moist, cool, even boggy, even standing water kind of sites. So it's often found along streams and seeps or around the edges of ponds. It gets to be a very large tree, especially in diameter. And I've not seen a full grove of it on Mary's Peak, but there are groves in the Cascades and in the Coast Range. And foliage is a good identifying characteristic. We have a whole bunch of trees that we call false cedars, and they're not at all related to the true cedars. And the only thing that I know that would call the early namers of plants to call these cedars is that they have fragrant wood like the true cedars, like the cedar of Lebanon and deodar cedar, but the foliage and the cones don't look anything like each other. So the top of the foliage is entirely green. If you turn over and look at the bottom of the foliage, they have this white butterfly pattern. Again, this is stomatal bloom. And to see the butterfly, this is a top wing and a top wing and a bottom wing and a bottom wing. And that uniquely identifies it as, Western red cedar. The cones are small. They're only about a ½ inch long. They're typically born upright. They develop in a year. So these are mature cones, and these are cones that will look like this at the end of the year. And when these really open up, you can really see the structure inside. The bark of Western red cedar is quite thin, quite fibrous, quite stringy, and was used for a plethora of things by Native Americans and early Euro-American settlers, and Greg will get into that later, I think. So here's another of our fall cedars. This one's called Port Orford cedar, and it's not native to Mary's Peak. It's only native to the southwest Oregon coast and northwest California coast. But there's a small grove of it, undoubtedly planted and perhaps in association with the old CCC camp that occurs near the beginning of the paved road up to Mary's Peak right off of 34. So if you take the nature trail, you may find a grove of Port Orford cedar that's actually naturalizing and producing seedlings, so it may grow larger over time. Its foliage is also very fern-like, and it's green above, but underneath, rather than having butterflies, it has distinct white X's in between the leaves. So in this is a leaf, and this is a leaf, and this is a leaf. So the X's are going between the leaves. These are the pollen cones. Cute little red things, almost look like ladybugs. These are the very inconspicuous female strobiles or cones that will develop into these cones, which are round and kind of leathery. They're not really very woody, although they do turn woody over time. They look a lot like juniper berries, except that you can always see the sutures on this where the scales are designed to open. And so this photograph over here, these are mature cones, and these are cones that later in the year will look like this. It has bark not dissimilar to the Western red cedar bark that we just saw. It's stringy and fibrous and had lots of uses. It gets a little more plated as it ages. Yeah, I'm gonna do a time check. 7:45, 30, 40. Okay, I better pick up the pace a little bit. So here are the common broadleaf trees that we'll look at. This is red alder, which at the time of Lewis and Clark, it's a very disturbance-related species. And so at the time of Lewis and Clark, it grew primarily along streams where there was erosion and deposition, and came in fast after fires. But because of human activities in the forest, like logging and road building, it's now spread way away from streams and occurs all over Coast Range and lower Cascade sites. People often use what they call the white bark to identify it. It's interesting that the bark of red alder is really grayish green, and it gets covered with these gray and white lichens, but nonetheless, you could call it bark. The leaves are egg-shaped. They're 3 to 5 inches long, and if we look at the edge of this, if we look at the bottom of the leaf, the underside of the leaf, we'll see that it's rolled under, and that helps you distinguish it from other leaves that may look like this. These are the male flowers. They're called catkins, and this is just an earlier stage of the male flowers. And so each of these strings would shed, I'm going to say, millions of pollen grains. throwing it off to the wind, trying to attract the attention of the female flowers like this, and these develop into these cones. Again, this a mature cone and this a maturing cone. Another good red alder characteristic is that the young twigs are distinctly triangular, and they have buds that are not joined directly to the twig, but they have their own little stalk, and that's unusual. Big leaf maple, many of you would know this already. So acer is the Latin name for maples, and macro means big leaf. Of the 125 or so species of maples in the world, big leaf maple has the largest, looking like this. And one distinctive characteristic about it is that the terminal lobe looks like it has a belt tightened around its waist. So it actually has a waist right here, and you can use that to separate it from other maple leaves, especially if you're in town. These are the clusters of flowers, and they have both male and female flowers in the same flower, and the female parts develop into these double samaras, which have hairy seed heads here. And some maples, many of them actually develop these large burls, and these can be caused by viruses, by bacteria, by mechanical injury. And these buds are formed with thousands and thousands of buds. The burls are formed, sorry, with thousands and thousands of buds inside. It would make a real swirly grain if you peel them or if you slice them, and they're used for making very high quality, expensive musical instruments and furniture. Golden chinkapin, a little bit of it occurs on Mary's Peak. It's much more common in southwestern Oregon and California. It grows all the way from sea level up to mid to high elevations in the Sierras. It has a lot of distinctive characteristics. Its leaves are simple and lanceolate or lance-shaped. They're evergreen, so they don't fall off in the winter. They fall off at some point in time, but not after just one growing season. Probably the distinctive characteristic is that they're golden yellow on the back. And these are the male catkins, again, producing pollen grains. These are the immature fruits that will develop within the same year to produce these spiny, sea urchin-like, very sharp clusters of burls. And here's bark, and then not particularly distinctive until you get used to looking at it. Oregon ash, Fraxinus latifolia, is a tree that's more common down on the floor of the valley than on Mary's Peak, but you'll certainly find it on Mary's Peak. And it's got pinnately compound leaves. So this is one leaf, and this is one leaf with multiple leaflets or small leaves attached to it. And you'll see where it attaches to the twigs, the leaves are opposite one another. And the fruits are samaras, like maple seeds, only they're single samaras, they're not joined at the head. And these are the male flowers, and these are the female flowers, and this is the way they grow in lined stream channels. They especially like to grow on silty, wet sites and can put up with water standing over their roots through much of the summer. And the twigs will, if the leaves exhibit an opposite arrangement, then so will the twigs. So it's easy to identify in the winter.
Excuse me, Ed, if this can be the last tree, because we're going to have to move on.
Can't easily be. In fact, I could stop here. Oh, okay, I'll go one. So this is black cottonwood, and the pollen-producing male flowers fertilize the females and develop these cottony tufts, hence the name cottonwood. Leaves have various shapes. They have kind of a white bronzy color on the backside. And many of you know that cottonwoods and relatives reproduce via root sprouts. They reproduce asexually, so the roots will run away from the tree and every once in a while produce vertical shoots. And this is a lateral root with new shoots developing, and these are the new roots that are going to support the growth of this. So I will call it there and pass it on to Greg to discuss cultural uses.
Thank you so much, Ed. That was wonderful. We look forward to talking with you more.
Okay.
Okay, Greg.
Sahayam Kanaway Tilikam Naga Bislike Kabashlish Tum Tum Naga Miflike Equa Uksan Naga Mislike Kaba Portland Ilihi Uksan. I just wanted to first kind of welcome you in our tribal language, Chinukwawa, and say happy to be here with you all this evening. And that I'm actually up in the Portland area doing this from there tonight at our office there. I'm just happy to be here with everybody. And I'll be sharing about some of the cultural uses of our tribal plants and trees that many of them which Ed talked about. And so I'll just go ahead and start. And so if you're not familiar with the tribes, Mary's Peak is within the Mary's River Kalapuya ancestral homeland areas. And our term we call it Mary's Peak is Chachindu. And that's for the eastern side of Mary's Peak is within the Mary's River Kalapuya, and then the eastern or western side is part of the Alsea and Kuna country. And the first tree I'll talk about is Douglas fir. Most people are familiar with it, being our state tree. In Kalapuya, we call it ontloth. In Chinukwawa, we'll call it a boom stick. And the tree has many different uses in regards to the boughs and stuff being used in branches in ceremonial purposes for different ceremonies and things like that, for doing cleansings and things like that. It's used often as part of the funeral ceremonies for cleansing and stuff. The needles are very useful for teas. A lot of the fir needles are used for different teas, often kind of mixed together also and to strength that way. The pitch is used. That's in Chinukwawa, the gum stick tree. We use that due to use of the pitch, and the pitch is used to make fire sticks. Long ago, when we didn't have flashlights and things like that at nighttime, they would get the pitch and make different types of pitch sticks for fires and light when using at nighttime. And then it was just used as a general firewood for the long winter days in the plank houses and things like that. The next tree is the western red cedar, and we call this the flustick, or the good tree. We have a kind of a econym or old story that tells how Bear was going along and she was asking the trees how beautiful she was. And so when she came to the cedar tree, asking the tree how beautiful she was, the cedar tree said, "Well, you're very, very beautiful." And so she said, "Well, then you'll have very, very many uses." And so the cedar tree is one of our primary important trees because pretty much from top to bottom, we have different uses of the tree. The roots are used for making watertight baskets. The bark is peeled off, and then we used in basketry and clothing. It can be used for rope and cordage. The branches also, small thin branches for rope and cordage twist together. And of course, the big trees were used for canoes and use in the houses. And here you see a piece of the bark that's been peeled with the outer bark removed, and then that's we actually put it away for a year after we gather it to season it, and then we'll start using it in basketry for making clothing. Then we'll go ahead and we'll kind of pound it to shred it, to make it nice and soft. In basketry, we just split it into different widths and lengths and thicknesses for the basketry. The hat I'm wearing today is out of the Western red cedar. And then of course, here's an example of our plank house that we have in Grand Ronde. And this has both the Douglas fir for some of the posts, and then also the planking that is the Western red cedar. And is similar to many of the plank houses throughout the Northwest. Western hemlock. The bark was used for making dyes for fishing nets. So different plants were used for making the nets. You could use stinging nettle, which is then fibrous. So we gathered that like after the first freeze of the year, get that dry, remove the outer hard part, and there'd be a lot of fibers in there, and gather up those fibers. And then those could be used for making the fish nets. And so if you've seen netto and the nets that would have to be made, you know, historically, the fish that we see like on the Willamette and Columbia River these days are much smaller than historically they were. Much common, more around 100 pounds and things. So you can imagine how strong those nets would have to be to hold those fish. But the nets would be made, and then sometimes they soak them into the Western hemlock bark to kind of dye them a little darker, make them a little harder for the fish to see. Pacific yew, as mentioned, this tree is pretty important to many tribes. In our tribes, it was one of the trees that could be used for making digging sticks that were used for digging the roots, such as camas and the yampa and things like that. So those sticks were they could be made out of the yew, or another common one was use of serviceberry. That they'd be a stick and it had a little curve at the bottom of the stick, a little sharper there. And then on top there would be maybe an elk horn handle that was used to push in and then twist to dig up the bulbs. So the yew would be made into a digging stick, or the serviceberry. They could be kind of hardened using fire and oil, and then be used for digging. And then there was also taboos. So if you were out digging in the old stories, economs, for instance, a bear or somebody would be digging maybe the camas roots or something like that, and their stick would break, and that's really bad news. So usually they'd have to return home to see what was happening. Very common in the old econom stories. Here's a digging stick here. We were using for digging camas in one of our camas gathering areas. The next plant is hazel, tukwala, we say in Chinukwawa. And the hazel was primary basket material as well as for the gathering of the hazelnuts. And the hazel is native plant to this area, very common in the area. Most of our tribes in the region used hazel up north because it has great flexibility. One of the issues today is that with the commercial hazel, they actually hybrid, and so you get variations in the sticks and how flexible they are. And the non-native being fairly brittle. So if you try to, we have a little test where we kind of twist it around our finger to see how flexible it is and see if it breaks or not. And you can tell whether it's going to be good basketry material or not. But what we'll do with the hazel is that the springtime is the time to gather of the hazel sticks. And so we'll be out there in the springtime gathering sticks, and it's easy to peel at that time. So then we're peeling it, removing that outer bark. And then again, we kind of let it set aside for the year to kind of season. And then we're ready to use them for the basketries. And they're used like for basketry frames, as well as you can see in the picture there, a hazel basket by Victoria Howard, who's Clackamas actually. And these were actually with the handles, very common baskets that were made in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that huge amounts of these baskets that tribal folks would make and then go to different markets and sell them. They'd make these type of carrying baskets. They'd make very, very large ones like for clothing hampers and things like that. But they were pretty common during that period of time. Victoria herself would gather her material along the Willamette River where she lived in Oregon City area. One of the things about hazel also is that it was important, a fire was important to use with the hazel, where they would burn these areas or kind of prune some of the trees to encourage the new shoots. And what you're looking for, like in the basketry, is for nice straight shoots of maybe 1 to 3 years old primarily. So that those fires would kind of bring in the new growth, and then we'd be gathering those new shoots. Also, some of the bigger branches, if they're nice and straight, can also be used due to that kind of flexibility, can be used for bows also. Big leaf maple, or uskin stick, we say in Chinukwawa, was common to use for some of the bigger sticks, would be used to make the harpoons that would also kind of be hardened and blackened for spears and harpoons. Can be 10 to 14, 20 feet, depending on the type of use they have. So those were commonly used from the maple. Fire sticks would also be used. Fire tongs would be made quite commonly. And then it was also used in for clothing. And here you see photos of the strips here. And here, again, in the springtime is the best time when you can peel the maple from the outer bark from the inner. And so here you see that process happening here, and then the strips that are made from that. And then that's set aside and used for making clothing. Historically, today we continue to use it for making dance clothing for some of our celebrations and events that we have. It's also used as for kind of tying things together also. The next is black cottonwood. And black cottonwood was one of those where Bear was going along and asking him how beautiful she was. And Black Cottonwood said, well, you're not very beautiful. So pretty much insulted Bear. So Bear said, well, you'll be useless. But we do have many uses for it. Often the roots are used, we'll get a piece and flatten. Can be used for the traditional method of fitting a stick, rolling it on that cottonwood base and rolling it. And then you have cedar fibers there to start fires. So that base piece was usually out of cottonwood. Some of the tribes actually use cottonwood also to make some of the river canoes. That was fairly common. And then we have stories of Coyote. And Coyote would be going along and he'd get himself in trouble. And so what he would do is usually he's being chased by somebody, so he's scurrying away. And to try and slow him down, what he would do is get some cottonwood and crush it up and blow it into the wind and make it snow. And so that was one of the techniques that Coyote would use to kind of get away from folks. The Oregon ash is another tree of importance. It likes to grow into kind of the wetter areas. And once it gets established, it kind of does pretty well. Our tribes used it for making different kinds of buckets. Here's one like for gathering, you've seen the photo, but we'd also make like flat pan ones also. Those would be used for cooking. Some of them would be watertight, so they'd be bigger, and then could hold water. And then the hot rocks from the fires would be put into those to cook the soups and the parch, like the tarweed or the wild sunflower seeds. They would use those and put the hot coals in the tarweed seeds. They'd keep it moving, so it didn't burn the bucket. And then those outer shells of the tarweed would be cracked open and they'd winnow them out. And so the buckets pans were used for those as one method. And then also another way was the use of junkus. Junkus made flat circular ones. But the buckets were also used fairly commonly for that purpose. The other thing is that the ash is also commonly used for making paddles. Good material for making paddles. Pacific dogwood, I have Pacific dogwood here, but then we also have red osier dogwood also. And these were used kind of similar to willow, where they would be used. It's got some flexibility, like for the summer houses or the sweat houses and things like that. Generally for those kind of purposes, and also like for fish traps and things like that. Pacific madrone. Some of our tribes kind of consider this tree, primarily our southern, very, very important tree. There's different taboos with the use of it. But like our southern tribe could also use some of the berries too as a food source. Chinkapin. Chinkapin is on here. You'll see the little nut on the outer part of it, and then inside, actually you'll see multiple little nuts in there, and those were used as a food source. Fairly common in Southern Oregon, and today you see it more and more in the Cascades also, as well as here at Mary's Peak. Red alder, or the peel skin stick, we say in Chinookwawa. And Ed was talking about how white the outer bark is, but when you get in below that layer, you can see it has at times really nice dark red. And so that red on the bark was gathered and used for dyes. And so what we do is gather that bark and boil it up, and then soak our materials in it, whether we want it to darken cedar or color it a little more. We have Woodwardia fern that is from southern Oregon, Northern California, and commonly we'll take that Woodwardia root, and to color it, we'll use the red alder for that purpose. The alder is also good for carving different utensils, so it would be used for carving spoons and plates and things like that. Big leaf maple and vine maple would also be used for those purposes also. And then just thinking the Western yew, the Pacific yew, we'd also use for making adze handles also. It's nice and hard and solid, so we use that for adze for carving, for the handles for those. Willow. Some tribes in some areas in southern Oregon, Northern California, willow is quite commonly used because of its flexibility. But our willow types up in this area, the native willows, are more brittle, and so that's why we used a lot more of the hazel. But we'll use the willow for different things. We'll gather it in the springtime also, and again, it's that time just before the leaves come out, and we'll gather it, and it's easy to peel. And so we'll gather it up and we'll use it for different other purposes. Like here in this bucket, you'll see that it's sewn together with the willow. So we'll make strips from the willow and use it for like tying together the ash buckets or the maple buckets. It's also used for like the fish traps and things like that. I didn't know how much time I would have, so I kind of held it to those, but we do have many other trees and shrubs that are on Mary's Peak that are used. Some of them include like the ocean spray and Pacific 9 bark. There are more kind of shrubs that you'll see and fairly common, and Pacific 9 bark being fairly strong was used for making arrows. A lot of them you can get nice and straight, so they were used for arrows. Ocean spray would be used more for the young people's arrows and things like that. We have vine maple, which is very rare to see, some nice straight ones, and being able to actually find a few of those years for making some bows out of those. And then vine was also good for carving materials and for making the utensils, seeing if we can get the larger pieces for that kind of purpose. We have cascara, which is a berry. A berry has fruit on it, and that was used as a medicine. So you do have to be careful in handling it. You handle it too much, it's a laxative. So you got to be kind of careful with handling it, but it was used for that purpose as a medicine, for a laxative. We have many of the different berries, like service berry, very common in the region, and those berries were gathered and dried and then pounded into cakes, saved for winter time. So you'll see a lot of that at Mary's Peak also. So those are kind of some of the trees and shrubs, and as part of the questions, if you have some questions about some of the others that you see, at Mary's Peak, we can answer questions about specific trees if you have some questions about them. And so we say hayu masi, many thanks, and thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Great. And Mike, can you take it on from here?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
We do have some questions, so if you all wanted to come back on, and Ed, if you wanted to join us, we have a few questions we can ask from the audience. And you can stay with us too, Greg.
Boss Greg, yeah.
Let me see. All right. So a few questions that we have. First question I have here for Greg. Nancy asks, how did people grind acorns for mash? Large rocks are hard to find in some parts of the Willamette Valley.
The tribes did use mortars. They had mortars which were from the hard rocks, but they had those as kind of part of their common household supply. So, you know, they knew where to look for them. A lot of the creeks and stuff have some nice boulders that could be, you know, pounded and picked to make the mortars and things like that, as well as the pestles. So those were still commonly used in the area.
Thank you. And a question for you, Ed. Someone thanks you for the information about the yew seeds and bird consumption. And they were wondering how many Pacific Northwest conifer species are aided by animal disposal of seeds.
Lots, I guess. You know, there's both small mammals especially, and many birds are seed storers. You know, they don't set out to distribute the seeds widely, but they want to hide them from other predators. And so they'll cache them somewhere or hide them as individuals and forget where they are or not need them, and will germinate and grow. So I couldn't put a number on it, but there are many examples of that. There's an example from the farther south in the range, white bark pine and Clark's nutcrackers, which are described as made for each other because their ranges overlap almost perfectly. The Clark's nutcrackers have very narrow beaks that can reach in between the scales of the cones and pull out the seeds, and they store them in their crop, and then they'll fly off miles and bury them somewhere. And of course, they can find many of them, but of course, many don't get found. And so there are some examples of very specific relationships between animal seed gatherers and hiders and the distribution of the plants, trees in particular.
Great. And Greg, question for you. Did the Kalapuya fell big trees or use them after they fell due to wind? And how much of a tree's bark could be stripped without harming the tree?
Yeah, I'd say a mixture of trees were used, either some felled ones or both where they fell them. And they had different techniques for doing that. And then they usually had crews to help with, ideally they would, like if they're making a canoe or something, they do it as close as possible to the river, but sometimes they'd have crews that could help move those canoes. They might build it there and then move the canoe down. And same for splitting of the planks for the plank houses and things like that, where they, you know, try to get them as close as possible to the location, or maybe they're a little upriver and they'll float them downriver with the canoes, things like that. And then when we go gathering for like the cedar bark, we only take like a hand, depending on the size of the tree, we'll take like a hand or 2 lengths like that as a strip. So we don't strip the whole tree when they're live. We'll just take a piece of it, and the trees will do fine. We've seen trees that are well over 500 years old that have those marks of where they've actually peeled or used that tree over multiple generations. It has the adze marks in them. from that, from gathering, peeling the big long strips, are for getting plank boards, maybe for cradle boards, or for a lot of our tribes that they had flattening, so they use the boards for that kind of purposes. So they're smaller pieces, but we've seen trees where they were actually multiple generations used, but those trees are fairly old.
Oh. A question about the cottonwood, black cottonwood, for Ed, I think. Does the black cottonwood reproduce by seed too, or just the the roots, I think, or the suckers that were there?
Yes, it also reproduces by seeds. So I'm going to say virtually all trees reproduce by seeds, and many broadleaf trees can reproduce by suckering from root shoots or underground stems called rhizomes, or from buds that occur at the base of the tree and cause multiple sprouts to come up around the tree. Big leaf maple and madrone are very good examples of that. But probably the only trees that don't reproduce by seeds are some of the genetically engineered clones that are designed not to produce seeds. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't.
Right, thank you. Greg, another question for you here. When one seasoned wood for basketry and other uses, where would it be stored? Should it be humid, dry, stored vertically, horizontally?
Yeah, historically in the plank houses, it would be dried up in the rafters. So, the fires are going during the winter time, the heat's rising, so they'd be up there in the drier areas. And then today, yeah, we make sure that wherever we're storing it is dry, cannot get damp. You don't want it to mold or anything like that. So you're working to be sure that it's dry, not too warm.
And, time for probably one or two more questions here. And I've got another one for Ed about the noble fir stands at the top of Mary's Peak. Were they there before the first settlers arrived, or about how old are they?
Most certainly before the first Euro-American settlers. I don't know the age of the trees, but I'm going to guess that the big ones up there are 250 years or so, but I don't know that for a fact. It's hard to tell when trees grow in harsh environments how large in diameter, how tall they're going to get, but certainly before Euro-American settlement, without a doubt. Dave, you might have some idea of the age of the older noble fir trees.
There was a OSU master's student named Billy Snow, back around, I think around the early 1950s, who did a master's thesis on that very subject. And I once knew the answer. I can't remember.
Well,
but you can go onto the OSU website or the archives or however they do it and look up that thesis, and Billy Snow, S-N-O-W, and that'll tell you everything you want to know about the age. And it doesn't say they were here or they weren't here. He can only say what's here now. And so the question is, what happened during the early settlers, Euro-American settlers? There's a lot of question about
just keep
that.
in mind that if you look up that resource, they're approximately 70 years older than they were when that was written. So,
right.
But if we see trees that are, I mean, they could be aged with increment cores. They could be aged with, some of them are cut down and there's a windfall and the trees are chopped up. You could approximate the age that way. And if they're older than the 220 years that would have passed since Lewis and Clark expedition, I'm going to say they were certainly there before Euro-American settlement occurred.
Greg, do you have any cultural stories that would give you a hint on that? And what the top
No,
of the Mary's Peak was?
yeah, and a lot of the old economists, they refer to furs, and they say that, areas that are where they're really thick and things like that, but they don't distinguish specifically what furs. Um, so yeah, but they are mentioned often in the old economy.
That has been a big question, is what was the summit of Mary's Peak? What was the ecology up there before? Because the settlers brought up cattle, which is, I can't even imagine that. They would herd cattle up to graze at the summit, and there was no roads. And that's quite a steep climb from Philomath. So they definitely had an impact, let's put it that way. There was cattle up there. And what that was and what the Euro-American settlers did up there so their cattle could be. I mean, it's a huge question. And I don't know, I wish somebody could answer that.
Maybe someday. Well, that's
Yeah.
about all the time we have for tonight. There's several more questions, but we gotta wrap it up now. I just wanted to thank Ed and Greg for their wonderful presentations. So much information there. Thank you, Dave, for coordinating the program and making it happen. And thank you everyone out there for attending this evening. Everyone registered for this event tonight will receive a link via email to the recording of today's event within the next day. The email also contains a link to the recording of the previous event and a link to register for the next event in the series. And the library will also be captioning this recording and making it available on the library's YouTube channel within the next couple of weeks, so you can look for it there as well. And that is all we have time for tonight. Thank you again. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Greg.